Hello, everybody. My name is John McAuliffe, and I'm delighted to be hosting tonight's event, which is the third of our new poetries launches. We have four brilliant poets who are going to be reading from the book for you tonight. And I'm going to introduce our first two poets. And then my co-editor and colleague at Carcanet, Michael Schmidt, is going to introduce the second pair of poets. We're going to begin with Jason Allen-Paisant, then Rebecca Hurst, followed by Charlotte Eichler and Susanna V Evans. But before we get on to the poetry, I want to remind you that you're going to be able to have, as we usually do, the text of the poems will be in front of you on the screen, so you'll be able to watch the poems as you go along, and the speaker will be in the corner in the box, and you can fiddle around with that to make the text or the speaker smaller as you see fit. The other thing that, and I can see people are already using it, hello Uzma, and hello Tom and others, if everybody please do use the chat function. We really like to get a bit of activity going there so we can respond to the poems, but also tell us where you're watching from tonight. It's dark now, but spring has arrived in Manchester, and it's been and we have needed it, and it's been a while coming. But do tell us where it is that you're watching from tonight. The link to the discount code is there in the chat already, and we'll post it again at the end of the night, so that you'll be able to pick up your copies that you'll have a discount on because you signed up for tonight's event. So our first reader tonight is Jason Allen-Paisant, and I first came across Jason when he came to Manchester to read at one of the 50th anniversary celebrations of Carcanet. He read that night a really terrific poem that I had first seen in PN Review a few months earlier. And that poem was called Walking with the Word Tree. And I think we are going to hear that poem again tonight. It stood out on the page. It stood out that night when I heard Jason read it for the first time. And it is actually one of the poems which has most stuck with me as I've gotten to know Jason and gotten to know his work for this anthology, and to work with him on the poems which are going to be published in his first collection this summer, Thinking with Trees, a book that we're really looking forward to. And maybe it is the pandemic. I don't think it's just the pandemic, but Jason's resetting of nature in England, in Yorkshire, but also in his home place in Jamaica is really something. There's a thoughtful questioning in these poems of human presences and the history of race in green spaces. It's certainly been a highlight of my reading and my thinking about poetry over the past year. As I said, Jason grew up in Jamaica, but he's now living in Leeds, where he is lecturer in Caribbean poetry and decolonial thought, and also the director of the Institute for Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies there. So please join me now in saying hello to Jason, and I'm looking forward to hearing the poems, Jason.
Hello, everyone. And thanks, John, for that lovely welcome and for your work on getting these poems together and out. I'm going to start with a poem called Roots. Roots. Summer's day in quartz, ship's smooth skin on water, broad beach of volcanic soars, 1,000 cells and more. Around me, the rocks are petrified alligators, gorgeous in black blisters. They butt the wind as if they could move again and pounce with the tide. I watch their swift running from among the dunes and listen to the waves rustle the leaves of stone. To my right, the silver sand sings. A lone seaside pine on a butt blooms into a parasol. My heart is a jumble of rocks. Inside, there are so many creatures, so many seas. Are those reptiles running, another time moving? Are the rocks a sea within a sea? I will sleep in the sand, in the rocks and the quartz that oozes like sores from the skin of granite. The silver sand sinks, and I do not know how far I will go. And the rocks and the sea sing about a time that is within, not mine, in a voice too low. To my right, the tropical sunshine and the lone seaside pine surrounded by the smoldering wicks of rock samphire. I have run to be here, far from home. The rain stings. It is cold. My knees burn from clumps of fescue as I kneel looking out to sea. Can we not from this height hear 10 volcanoes spitting their lava to create the islands? And beside it, we have a place to live in God's dust. I want to know more about the roots that nourish the rocks, that keep them tall and flourishing. My second poem is called Daffodils, Speculation on Future Blackness. And I'm happy to be reading this poem now at a time when, as John says, we're definitely feeling spring in the air. That's always a special feeling. And it's good to be able to read a spring poem at the coming of spring. So I could perhaps say a little bit about this poem. It's a poem that's dear to me. I wrote it, unsurprisingly, in a setting of spring, and while asking a lot of the questions that I'm asking in the book, namely, as John said, black bodies in green spaces, how the history of race conditions what landscape actually means and what different bodies mean, our bodies mean in the landscape. And I obviously thought about the iconic flower daffodil, and I thought about the iconic poetry around daffodils. And I remember learning Wordsworth's Daffodil in my primary school class, perhaps around grade 5 or 6. And I think you can see a lot of the questions about beauty, bodies, iconography, image and narrative here. Daffodils, speculation on future blackness. It's time to write about daffodils again, to hear a different sound from the word daffodil. Imagine daffodils in the corner of a sound system in Clapham. Can't you? Well, you must try to imagine daffodils in the hands of a black family on a black walk in spring. The next poem that I'll read is one that John talked about. It's called Walking with the Word Tree. To have money is to have time. To have time is to have the forests and the trees. I look at my baby, mind sliding in the sticky film of the bud, rubbing her thoughts between fingers, and knowing the purple lips of the involucres in her mouth. And me, am I living my childhood all over again? For her, a wood will not be burned for fire coal, where the pig pen is, where you hide from your mama, where you escape from scolding and rolling eyes, where the duppies live, where the madman lives, where wild animals, stray dogs, and the unwanted go to die. And me, am I living my childhood all over again? A child's way of pinching flowers, a child's way of touching buds, but what I had never known, this way of listening to the forest. Did Daisy, Miss Patsy's 11th child, and my playmate even know her name was a flower? In Porus, life was unpastoral. The woodland was there, not for living in, going for walks, or thinking. Trees were answers to our needs, not objects of desire. Wood fire. Catch butterflies along the way to grandmother on the other side of the yam field. Just don't do something foolish, like lose the money or take too long so the pot don't cook before daddy reach home. There's a way of paying attention to plants, a way of listening to trees, a way to hold a flower in your hand. Now that I'm here in a park in England, and I stop when called by the pistils of a tree. There is something in the pink that speaks so clearly to me, saying, glad you stopped. I saw you from far away. I don't even know what they call it, but I want to know what it tells me about itself. Its appearance with thousands of others on this tree that up to April seemed like death. Our parents and grandparents planted yams, potato slips, reaped tomatoes, carrots, and so on. Then market, then money, then food, then clothes, then shoes to go to school. Now I'm practicing a different way of being with the woods, only I try not to stray too far from the path. The daisies glitter at my feet. And the final poem that I'll be reading is called Autumn. Out of season, but there you go. It's in the book. I'll be reading it. Autumn. I enter. Peel off the skin of my living room. It is October, while the red floor of the woodland stretches like an avenue through high maples and oaks. My feet press down into the leaves, and I wonder how many seasons lie here beneath my feet. Here, there is no enclosure, only cells, making sounds on a frequency so low in a world distant from words, unpossessed and full. Thank you.
Terrific to hear. Terrific to hear those poems, Jason. They sound great, and great to hear on a dark night as well. The brightness in them. We're going to hear next from a poet who I think does share some common territory and even interest in the way that she thinks about the natural world with Jason, and that's Rebecca Hurst. Rebecca's poems, Rebecca's amazing poems, I should say, are open to the world and to different kinds of form and voice in a way that seems to me to be deeply unusual and original. The poems draw on so many different kinds of voice and tone, and I think the poem that one of the poems she's going to read for us tonight is Mapping the Woods, which is just a great example of what she manages to draft into her work. I remember that Michael rang me when it came in to PN Review, initially where it was first published, to say that he had found something that was new and that worked. And there's just a real excitement when you come across a substantial poem like this. Rebecca also works across many disciplines and in interdisciplinary ways. She wrote her critical study for her PhD on Russian folk tales, and the language of folk tales also, and the sort of iconic images of the folk tales also make their way into her poems. She also works as an illustrator, and she's been a very successful librettist, working with the Voicings Collective, which is based here in Manchester, and her work with composers there has led to work being performed for the Royal Opera House and Aldeburgh and other places. So I'm really looking forward to hear Rebecca reading the poems from New Poetries VIII.
Hello, and hello there. Thank you so much, John, for that really wonderful introduction, and thank you to John and Michael for including me in this anthology. It's such an honor to be reading tonight with Jason and Charlotte and Susanna. And yeah, I'm going to be following Jason's incredible poems with another seasonal poem. I'm not going to read the whole of Mapping the Woods, which is quite a long sequence, but I will start off by reading part 2, which is the spring equinox. I'm going to read from the screen. Spring equinox, 20th of March, 2010. Sunrise, 06:03 a.m. Sunset, 06:10 p.m. Sugar moon, stiff hands flexing. Station Street to High Street, down Fletching Street to Coggins Mill. The air is tepid and thick. Mist draws down along the sandstone ridge. Traffic reporting from the A26. Birdsong, quadraphonic, simulcasting spring. I feel it too. Yawn, warming as I walk, and my body yields. At Johnny's house, a bedroom window is propped open. We shout in the dark, "Wake up, Lapsy," and a lean shadow calls, "Good morning, be right down." We take a thermos of tea, fill our pockets with Simnel cake, and tie our bootlaces tight. 6:04 a.m., a minute past the day's dawning, but no sun, just grey cloud and the clatter of the burn, rain-choked and precipitate. We circle the rough-sketched woodland, walking in silence. Downstream from the hammer pond, we paddle along a reach of gravel. Above us, the bank rises 10 feet sheer. We dig in the clay for nuggets of charcoal, slag, and ore, grubbing out a lump of iron big as my head. It is cast with foliage, a dainty kissing ball made of lion's mouth, celandine, hemlock, and stitchwort. Later, we sit in a row on a gate and Johnny tells a story he heard from Alf Cloud. There was a white bullock round as the moon who broke a fence and lost himself deep in this tangled thicket. He dwells here still, and each year in March, there's one who will see him. And they're in for a hard year, poor soul, for a glimpse of the white stot bodes ill. We nod, make note and eat our sandwiches. 12 hours pass in doing not much, but walking and watching the shift in shade and tone on this sunless day. We wash our hands and drink from the spring, tie 3 dozen ribbons to the ash tree that sprouts nearby, a wish for every bright strip of cloth binding us close to this crooked place. The flat light drains colour from the fields, submerges the intricacies of the wood and exhausts the gaze. Nightfall revives the faded landscape just as it begins to rain, and we see the gleaming bones of a long dead oak and the bronze and mauve of budding trees. Still walking, homeward now, heads down against the rain, ready to see this bout through, we cover the conifer plantation, make our last lap along the little Rother. Mud licks our boots, we walk blind, night-fallen, sure-footed, until the path dips and there is a flurry, like a leaf turning in the breeze. Sian stops, peers down. A toad, she calls out in warning and summoning, for then there is a frog and another toad, and 5, 6, 7 more. Leaping up from beneath our feet, green and gold on grey. We walk, single file, heads bowed, and counting our steps with care on this most lively road through the woods, knowing they've woken to warmth and dark and wriggled from their muddy holes to mate in the puddles and ponds where they were spawned. We hear them crooning now, for this damp gloaming is their unimaginable high noon, and the wet and the warmth and the woods have cooled, and they have come. So the second poem that I'm going to read is takes us out of the woods. And it's a poem that actually started, I think, in my mind when I was about 16 years old and working in a pub kitchen in Mayfield, in the village that the Mapping the Woods poems are set. One of my Sunday morning jobs was to cut up a huge pile of red cabbages. And I think that close looking stayed with me over the years. And finally, when I saw Leonora Carrington's cabbage painting, the poem came together in my head. So I'll just wait. There we are. It's on the screen now. So this poem is dedicated to my friend Fatima. Slung from a trug, it rumbles across the kitchen table, this flabby magenta fist of stalk and leaf, this bundle of pages flopping loose from their binding, this globe cleaved with a grunt leaning hard on the blade, and I look down on this confounded universe, halved in my hand, shout, I can believe in the cabbage. And yes, lean in to sniff iron and damp earth, prod the pleats packed with butterfly eggs, constellations neat as a convent girl's stitches, this leathery creased leaf, a dish of galaxies, this bloody alchemical rose, this labyrinth, quick, keen, I unscrew a jar of condiments, cinnamon sticks, star anise, and clove, shout louder, I believe in the cabbage. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Michael Schmidt. I'm the other half of the editorial team. And I want to wish you all a happy World Book Day. There have been many Gruffalos loose in the streets today, and some Paddingtons and even a few cats in hats, despite the Dr. Seuss scandal. You may think it odd that we're celebrating World Book Day with the third launch of the same anthology. And there are two more to come. You might think we're jumping up and down on the same spot. I hope you'll agree after tonight and after the first two sessions as well, that a book called Poetries is, with the plural on poetry, is an oddment. There are 24 very different voices. And tonight you're hearing 4 of those different voices. Each is potentially a new friend, a new challenge, a new possibility. And each contains a variety of voices. It's not just as though each of the poets reading has one voice. They have a number of voices. And these anthologies are quite crucial to Carcanet. They're markers for our future. Poets usually come to us through peer review, and they find us and we find them, and we invite them into the anthology. And in some cases, after the anthology, a book materializes, as in the case of Jason, and I'm sure others who will follow in his train. The first poet I'm introducing today is Charlotte Eichler. We invited Laura Scott, whose poems kicked off the New Poetries VII, the previous volume to this one, and whose first book, So Many Rooms, won the Seamus Heaney First Collection Prize, to be Charlotte's poetic godmother in our blog. We have blogs about each of our new poets. Laura urges us to read Charlotte's poems very slowly. She calls them astonishing, and she focuses on 3 elements in the poems. It's a very shrewd piece of criticism. First, she says the way the poems move sinuously. Their easy flight, she quotes one of the poems, their easy flight from one shape to the next, which is a suggestively sort of Ovidian image, and evocation is a natural and uncontrived ease in their flow that she's taking notice of. And then she draws our attention to Charlotte's pronouns, a we that invites us into complicity from the beginning. And Laura says the voice speaking in the poems is plural and social, intimately linked to another consciousness. And when Charlotte changes pronouns to I and you, there's a very sharp change of key and register. I think this is very effective. It's like setting an expectation and then playing on it, which anything that is surprising comes against a bed of expectation. And finally, she notes the abundance and unexpectedness of the imagery in the poems. She draws attention to Charlotte's recurrent image of eggs, where they come up, what they're doing, what they promise, and what they threaten. Charlotte herself calls attention to how many animals there are in her poems, as if Mrs. Noah was introducing us to the bill of lading of the Ark. 18, she says, in the poems in the anthology. They're weird and eloquent animals. They can be read as literal or as quasi-allegorical figures, or both. Charlotte has lived all over the world's northern hemisphere, from St. Petersburg to San Francisco, Hertfordshire to West Yorkshire. Her Leeds MA is in Norse and Viking studies, something that rather puzzled me, I must say, but she's explained it to me now. Her first contribution to PN Review was in 2018 and was most welcome. Rory Waterman reviewed her first Valley Press pamphlet in PN Review, saying, "These unsettling and precise poems, metaphorical, mythological, comprehensible, for all that, long outlast the time it takes to read them." I've gone back to her again and again. So Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. The first poem I'm going to read, I wrote after reading a tweet by a man who wrote that he couldn't imagine what women between the ages of 40 and 80 would do with their lives if they didn't have children. And the tweet prompted a very beautiful thread of people describing all the various excellent things that they plan to do with their lives. And a recurring theme in the thread was spending more time at or in the sea. So the poem is called Swimming Between Islands. The island you were born on is crammed with cabinets and grandfather clocks. Nearby, the island of children with its shrieks and red tapestries, and the island of one day, when. You have the sea and its bed, a silvery current of hair, and a necklace of eggs where 100 new things grow. The horizon looks toothed, but those are more islands. The island of slow translation, the island of choirs, an island of frogs who spend their lives inside flowers. On some you'll find you breathe better underwater than in their thundery air. Soon you'll have an island forest, ribcage ferns exhaling green. Swimmers will come to your house to borrow your eyes. This next poem I'm going to read, I wrote for my friend Harriet. We've been friends since we were 7, and we used to wander around the village where we grew up, collecting ladybirds and trying to train them to do tricks. And we also used to play those games you play when you're a child, where you're trying to predict the future. And the poem is called Divination. We knew everything, playing Oracle on the carpet. Saturdays crawled with our ladybird circus. From the ends of our fingers, solemn as blood, we sent them to find our future husbands. We let them trickle down our wrists into the bird bath to see if they'd keep walking while we drowned them, jealous of their easy flight from one shape to the next. Now, like hanged men, we want to buy futures, and there's someone doing tarot at the end of Brighton Pier. Stars are poking holes in the sky. There's an airy clatter of cards falling into place, but stranger things are happening beneath our feet. Coppers chink through the boards onto rows of starlings, stacking themselves like decks, noisy as a masked ball. We think fluke has something to do with wings, then remember whales gliding despite the weight of all they know. We watch the stragglers find their place under the pier, all the sea's dark spread ahead of us. This next poem I'm going to read deals with some slightly darker childhood memories of visiting elderly relatives when we were small, and it's called Survivors. Aunts drink tea for hours. They have no mirrors or clocks, but each other's faces tell the time. Why do their hands shake and rattle the cups in their saucers? We prowl the flat, the hallway dark with years of coats, the dining room with carpets on the walls. Each visit we think something will be different, but there's always the same red viewmaster with unchanging views of Prague and no TV. We draw elaborate tunnels and hold funerals for bees. The cheese plant grows towards the window. Our aunts show us a glass case of curled up figures. All we want is the china cockatoo and toy koalas. Their arms come towards us lined with numbers. We wriggle away from their touch. For the next poem, all you need to know is that cuttlefish have got 3 hearts. Clean white bones. 2 cuttlefish are waving in their glassy world as I go to hold your hand. Our fingers clash, and I wonder if it's any easier for them, with 20 legs to tangle, 6 hearts to please. They speak a patterned language of moody stripes and flashes, the signs of love imprinted on their skin. Leave their eggs like a dropped necklace, ruffled versions of themselves suspended in each blackened bead. I shift and break our grasp, thinking of the jewel you offered, of all their hearts and our half-hearted kisses. If we could take their place, there'd be no mess, just our children in the weeds, brightening like bulbs. The next poem I'm going to read was written during lockdown, and I've noticed that quite a few of the poets doing these launches have read lockdown poems, but I didn't realise that this was a lockdown poem until I'd finished writing it, because it's about Pabay, which is an island in Orkney that I visited a few years ago. But when I'd finished writing it, I realised it was suffused with that feeling of being stuck far away from the people that you love, and with that sense that time and distance are doing really strange things that we've got during the pandemic. And it's called Pabay Cliffs. Belly to grass, greenish jelly sea below. Here, next to my face, miniature worlds of moss. Tiny trees and stars, near and far as the queue of strangers behind me, waiting their turn to look down at the guillemots hidden by the cliff's pleats, each precariously at home. Oh, warm egg bodies, the rocks look soft enough down there, greened with weed. In the distance, killer whales, fins tall as you. And the last poem I'm going to read is about the magical blacksmith called Verland, or in Anglo-Saxon folklore, he's known as Wayland the Smith. And in Norse mythology, he is married to a Valkyrie called Hervor. And this poem is written from her perspective. Hervor and Vorland. I held the birds of myself together for 7 years. When I left with his ring, he made 700 to tempt me back. Offered earrings like green eyes, brooches of milk teeth, silver cups like small skulls. I put our sky blue eggs beyond his reach, up where distance softened everything to feathers. I loved his hands, their blacksmith skill. He loved black velvet bark after a fire. But it wasn't only metal he could shape. Now he's far above me, a vulture with black fingers and a blood drop head. Our children's veins were green lit, young trees with the smell of smoke already in their branches. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that gorgeous reading, Charlotte. That was really lovely to hear. My next poet, our last poet for the evening, is Susanna V Evans. Susanna's godmother, as it were, in our blog was Tara Bergen. You may remember that Tara kicked off the New Poetries V, the first poet in New Poetries V, with a poem some of you will also have by heart. This is Yarrow. Tara found herself reading Susanna's poems, imagining Susanna's notebook. It was a notebook with no blank pages in it at all. I decided that it is crammed with words, says Tara, words and sightings and diagrams, all revolving around the things that fill her poems: boat yards, boat builders, barnacles, rocks, sea. The notebook and the poems are not diary-like, Tara thinks. She sees him focusing imaginatively on the given world, on the world's things, on the world's people, its creatures and plants, all of their strange behaviors, she says. The notebooks are filled with the sounds of spoken language, not of voice, but voices, voices heard and engaged with. And Tara says the poems are preoccupied with their subject matter, or is it object matter? And as such, get it to reveal itself to us. I love this notion of object matter, the poet in a kind of Rilkean spirit, being a voice for, not a spokesman for, but a voice for the objects that speak through her. In her author picture, when I admire it, I've not, to my recollection, met Susanna. She seems very at home with boats and their elements and the sea. She loves, especially, she reports, the art and writing of Eileen Agar, who is a kind of touchstone and inspiration for her. Her suggestive incongruities mean a lot to Susanna, teasing juxtapositions that never look as though they happen by chance or by accident, and always disclose a deep design. And that's what her poems tend to do as well. She's also drawn, much to my surprise and delight, to the gratuitous and the transcendent that David Jones discovers in poems and evokes in his essays. David Jones is one of her other touchstones. The given world, which we receive, has a giver. And these poems make wonderful sounds and they make wonderful connections. And I come back to them to hear them over and over again. Susanna's first contribution to PN Review occurred in 2018, as did Charlotte's, and she contributed another wonderful bouquet of poems in 2020. And the door remains open to her and to all of our new Poetries poets. Anyway, over to you, Susanna.
Hi. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here reading tonight, and I'm very happy to be in the anthology as well. I'm going to start by reading a poem based on the British surrealist artist Eileen Agar's sculpture Marine Object from 1939. The sculpture is made up of found objects from beachcombing. So there's a Greek amphora, which was pulled from the sea by fishermen in the south of France, which Agar spliced with a ram's horn from Cumberland and starfish and a few other objects as well. So this is Starfish Balancing at Your Throat. A horn, a shell, a starfish, a terracotta, a yes, a lip, a burnished, a thinking, a drowning, a crying, a barnacle, a wave, a heap. Waves once wept over these barnacles that spot you like freckles. Lips once touched the lip of this jug, and hands once handled it. Terracotta can break as men can break. Waves break when you pick them up. A starfish is on the lip, the very lip of the jug, the very lip and heart and throat of the jug, where once water poured. An amphora found, an amphora found broken. An amphora like an ampersand, found in the sand and dredged up. An amphora split in two like a heart, like the rose inside of a clam, split in two and spliced too with the objects of 2 years ago. A crustacean, a flotsam, a lip, a horn, a ram, a bellow, a drinking. A howl though, a follow, an amplifying, a Greek, a French, a starfish. And that final hand gesture is for the asterisk starfish at the end of the poem. The next poem I'm going to read is slightly more pared back. I wrote it about a year after I was poet in residence at Underfall Yard, which is a working boatyard in Bristol. And it's written after the French prose poet Francis Ponge, but written after Ponge in the very loosest sense of the word after. So this is Christmas at the Yard, also quite unseasonal, barely after Francis Ponge. Winter, in the end, can be summed up by those white boats, quiet swans covered with a thin layer of snow. The boat builders work with bowed heads, shifting round the yard like bright pieces of sunlight, puffing clouds into the sky. Paperwork is done with mittened hands. Nature unveils her bare-boned self, brittle and branched, silhouetted in late afternoon light. She blows cool air into the workshop, hardens paint in tins, strokes the yard cat with icy fingers until it mews. A cormorant dives and emerges in a tree ring of ripples, a necklace of eels in its mouth. In the powerhouse, presents are opened with gloved hands, faces are shining Christmas baubles. Nature closes her eyes and dreams snow into the yard, where it falls, quietly, until even the lemon yellow hull of the boat by the pontoon is obscured. And the last poem I'll read is a little bit longer. It's a one-sentence poem written when I was at Under4 Yard in 2019. And while I was there, I really fell in love with the language of boat building, the various nautical, marine terms that I came across. But this poem is about a part of a boat that I couldn't find a name for. So I solicited ideas from passers-by to form something of a collaborative poem. So this is Barnacle Oblong. Having been told by the boat builders that there is no name for the hollowed space between the keel and the rudder, for that oblong space that is like the body of a fish, the space that peeks out behind the white and aqua hull of the boat that Jasper saved, the little Hilliard, the little 9-meter Hilliard named Puffin. Having been told that the space is for a propeller, but that there is no name for the space, I cast around and ask the boatyard strollers, the visiting tourists, the women with pushchairs, the men with long cameras, the children with caps, what they might call that space, standing next to Wind's Clair de Lune, that beautiful white boat with the peeling hull, the rusting rudder, and that unnamed space peering out behind. And they say, laughing at first, looking round, rudder hole, prop gap, propeller housing. And Andy, passing, says, wiggle space, spin space. And Julie says, prop shaft exit, sounding technical. And then serious men who pass say, propeller aperture, rudder gap. And one wonderful woman says, the void, and walks off silently. And I think, moon void. And a laughing man says, the no idea, the nautical gap. And another man says it looks just like a bow, an archer's bow. And then words build and pour. Boat crescent, hull crescent, the sea, the cake slice, rusted teardrop, interrupted moon, I think, as someone says moon, then moon cut. The reverse D, the knotty question, spare space, spin spot, Philip, knobber. And one woman who used to be an English teacher says, aerated vista. And one man scratching his head says, the hole and gap, like the space is a pub, a beloved space. And a passing Frenchwoman says, l'aileron, the word lilting out into the air. And the German girl pauses, thinks, says, das Hörnchen. And the man she's with says, backwing. And now the boatyard is alive with words taking wing. Media Luna, Navigation Alcove, Pickle Moon, Sickle Moon, Propeller Crevice, Quor Blimey, the D-Space, Thrust Capsule, Half Moon, and I think Griddle, Barnacle Oblong. Thank you very much for listening.
It's such an amazing poem that Susanna, I think everybody here is excited to hear all of those names for not a thing. Yeah, it's sort of wonderful. I'm sure we could probably improvise something in the chat maybe in response as well, but it feels wonderfully endless. So and great to hear all of the poems just now. We've had a treat, you know. So I know Michael and I, we are thinking we might ask you just one or two questions just to see if you'd like to talk a little bit about your work in the context of the anthology, maybe as well. Michael, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated how different all four of you are, despite some similar subject matter between some of you. And I wonder how it feels to be in a crowd which is so differentiated. A crowd of 24, I don't think we've ever had quite so many poets in a New Poetries. I think we had 22 in the last one. And I wonder whether you feel that your uniqueness is thrown into greater relief by the uniqueness of the others. I'm going to ask Charlotte to answer that question.
I didn't really think of it in terms of uniqueness in that way. I was noticing all of the similarities. I think you mentioned in the beginning of the anthology in your introduction that there seems to be a shared obsession with the sea, especially among us four and quite a few of the other poets in the anthology. So I think I was just noticing at an image level that there was this, I don't know where it comes from, because poets have always written about the sea, obviously, but everyone is doing really different things with it. It's not usually some grand metaphor centralizing humans. There's a lot of focus on the minutiae of the lives of tiny creatures, like as in Susanna's work.
Yeah,
I don't know what that's doing, but it's something to do with current ecological urgency, I suppose, that writers are feeling.
And you get that in Jason's poems too, the ecological urgency along with other political themes. Susanna, did you feel that as well?
Yes, I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about the book, the experience of being in it, but also as a reader, is the sense of conversations that are happening across the book and within the book, and the affinities within the book. I think there are several writers who I feel a very strong affinity with, whether that be because, like you're saying, Charlotte, of the focus on the sea, or whether it's to do with voice or formal concerns. And I think it's really nice having those connections across the book, despite the great difference in form and in content between all the different writers. But it's felt a little bit like having a sort of companionship over lockdown, I think. And all the poets can be enjoyed in these very different ways in different contexts. So for example, with Rebecca's poems, I went for a very long country walk recently, and I had her poems in mind when I was walking, and I was looking at the moss and thinking about her poetry, and then I came back and I just sank into the work. And I think that's been a really nice thing when we haven't, like other people have been saying, we haven't had as much contact with people. I felt, especially through hearing the videos and the introductions and having this real sense of what each poet is doing, it feels like sitting down with these familiar voices and almost friends from just reading the anthology, and that's been a real pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah. I've been thinking that I don't get a sense of a significance or a primacy of narrative poetry in this collection. I don't know what other people think. Like, I think the stories matter, or the experience matters less here than this atomizing of objects and of things, this desire to look deeply at objects around us, to kind of look below the surface or closer than we've looked before. I don't know if I'm wrong, but this is a sort of overall feeling that I get. I don't know what other people think about that. This sort of like primacy of objects over experience.
But I think that is possibly the case. But what really drew me to almost each of the poets in the book was not what they were saying, but the sounds they were making. And when I was listening to you reading, the variations in pace, for example, which I think John commented on, were really quite eloquent, and you do things quite differently. The very stilled quality of Charlotte's reading, for example, it was very stilled, and the focus seemed to be entirely on the world. But and it struck me that it was the sounds that were being made that makes the poems distinctive and different. Rebecca.
Sorry, I had to mute myself because of some background noise. Yeah, I think the question about uniqueness, I guess, the thing that struck me was the intensity of the language and the sort of infinite variety of ways that you can look at trees, for example. You know, I really loved hearing Jason's reading of trees coming before mine, and I've written down a line, trees were answers to our needs, from his reading, and that line is just sort of is going around in my head right now. And I think that was the great thing reading through this anthology for me, was what can be done with language and how interesting it is and how various and how you can never get tired of it. I guess trying to construct poems and look at things, as Jason said, deeply, look at objects and figure out what you want to say about them.
I wondered if I could follow up a little bit on that, Rebecca, maybe starting off by asking you another question as well, which is about language. Given that it's World Book Day, as Michael has reminded us, but other languages, and I suppose not languages outside the usual range of poetry, as well as, say, Russian in your case. But I wondered if I could ask you a little bit about drawing in unusual kinds of language into your poems, and like it takes an effort to do that. It's not something that comes naturally to people, I guess, but it really struck me in your readings tonight, the way that you're reaching for different kinds of language to make your poems hospitable to them. So I wondered if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I guess just talking about my Mapping the Woods poem, some of the language that I use in that, and in other landscape poetry that I've written that is based in Sussex, I've drawn on Sussex dialect, which is not a dialect. I grew up hearing it, but not speaking it, and I think even as a child, I sort of regretted that separation of the language I was learning from the place. I could sense the sort of losing of it. And I think that part of my sort of childhood sense of that is maybe connected to my grandmother, who was half Russian, and her sort of mother tongue, the first language that she grew up speaking, was Russian, but she moved to England when she was 10 and found it a very unwelcoming place to someone who had an accent and for whom English was not her first language. So she did not pass that language on to her children or to her grandchildren as a result. And so I am sort of frustrated in being monolingual, I guess, but looking at other ways to draw language. You know, I've studied Russian, but any sort of fluency has completely evaded me in it. So yeah, those are the sort of thoughts.
I might try and draw in, because Charlotte also has Russian in her background.
I noticed that.
I wondered if I might bring you in to talk to that and about the kinds of language in your.
Yes, I think one of the poems, the one I didn't read, the Cathedral of the Spilled Blood, that's in the anthology, has a tiny bit of Russian in it. But I think maybe there's a similar story in my family to Rebecca's, which is my granddad was from Czechoslovakia, and he was Jewish, and he came to Sheffield just before the war. And he spoke 5 different languages, but at that time, living in England, he just wanted to assimilate, and he didn't teach his children any other languages. And so they grew up just only speaking English. And for some reason, I've just always wanted to learn as many languages as possible. And I did Russian at university, and I did French and German. And now I work for a bibliography of medieval studies, which is too difficult to explain right now, but we have to read articles in every different language because we're bringing together all the research done all over the world in the field of medieval studies. And I think maybe it's just the sounds of that come into my poetry, rather than particularly trying to ever do any translation or anything like that. But
there's another element of language which I do think is very present in your poetry, Charlotte, and possibly less so in some of the other poems we heard tonight, and that is the relationship to the English past, the English tradition. We had Wordsworth popping into Jason's neighborhood, but when I first started editing, I was always fascinated by the relation that younger poets had with older poets in the tradition, and even dead poets. I mean, obviously, Milton was someone we still read. We even read Spenser in my time. And if you were writing landscape poetry, there would be some kind of relationship, first of all with Marvell, possibly, but also with Clare. And there is a sense in which that informing tradition, that enabling tradition, is perhaps less experienced by some of the younger poets that we're looking at today, not some of the older poets in the anthology, but some of the younger ones, as though the huge resource that is English poetry is somehow not yet being fully accessed. This is a question, though it does sound like a statement, but it's a question. Nobody has to answer it, of course. Many questions I ask have no answers.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Michael. I've been thinking about my own work in light of that. Sometimes I feel like I make a deliberate effort to write against what I've read.
Mm-hmm. That's a very positive, in a sense, it's a very positive thing to do. I mean, you have all the great poets like Rosenberg and so on trying really to make a break, but they know what they're breaking from. And my real concern as a reader and as a lover of English poetry, of world poetry, but especially of English poetry, is this terrible feeling that it's on the ebb. It's not only Leicester stopping the medieval courses and so on. I mean, we learn so much from Chaucer and Gower and Gawain, but it's also the loss of Shakespeare, the loss of Milton, even the loss of Herbert. I mean, we still read Donne, but Herbert is sort of vanishing. The sense of all these amazing coals that are still glowing, but we don't seem to warm ourselves at them anymore. Or I do, but and I hope eventually, as time passes, everyone who writes in English will discover them. Discover them either to reject them or to write against them or to nourish themselves with them. And I can understand where you're coming from, Jason. That makes a lot of sense. Though there are poets there that would be very enabling, I suppose, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other side of the coin is that you can't write without engaging with what has come before. So you're doing, both realities coexist. The other thing that springs to mind is what we've kind of alluded to, that like in the room, air quotes, among us are people who who think and work across so many different languages. So you're not necessarily just engaging with poetry written in English. Certainly in my case, I mean, there's been a period in my life when I read more in French than, you know, read more French poetry than, you know, I think Susanna could say the same. I think all of us in some way might say the same. So I guess I wonder how that cacophony of voices influences the material that we work with. How does Victor Hugo
do you want to come in on that?
Say that again, John, what did you say?
I'm wondering, Susanna, if you'd like to come in on that.
Yeah. I think sometimes I agree, Jason, and I think that sometimes there are slant ways of accessing this sort of material as well. So for example, I'm just thinking of, so I'm currently doing a PhD on T.S. Eliot and French poetry. And he compares some of the 19th century French poets to the metaphysical poets. And you sort of have this sort of argumentative strain in Laforgue sometimes, which is a bit like Donne. Or you have, I mean, Laforgue, for example, has a really argumentative son poem, which is a bit like Donne's busy old fool, unruly son. Whatever he says. So I think that there are these sort of, like Jason's saying, these sort of sometimes different traditions behind us that are kind of actively sought out in the way that, but I agree. I think it's good to be as widely read as possible and to have a good grounding in English literature. But I think sometimes, the language thing can be very informative as well, and sort of reading across languages and in different languages. I think that does something interesting to your brain as well, if you're sort of working in that sense. Even translating, I think that does something it changes you, I think, to read these other kinds.
It is interesting to think that one of the great French, English and Latin poets was a single man, and that was John Gower, who actually wrote in all three languages and wrote major, if not great, poetry in each of them. And I think all through the English language tradition of both American and British and Antipodean and so on, there is this continual dialogue with other poetries. When we speak of English, we tend to think of it as closed off, but it's always been a wide open tradition, hungry in different directions. So I think possibly what you're talking about is exactly what earlier poets did, but they always had truck with the classics and they had truck with Latin. And this, in a sense, was the background for a European poetry, which made it possible for them to read French poetry and German poetry and Italian poetry rather differently from the way we do with our more monoglot antecedents. I'll be Hurst.
8:05, so I might, sorry, we've just gone past 8:05, so I think we were planning to finish on the hour. But one of the things that struck me reading the book is how many poets from different countries and from different cultures and even from different languages who are writing in English as well as in the language they grew up in. And we heard from Parawana last week. We hear from Benjamin Nahammer in I think next week. And it's one of these great things. It makes me, the lovely phrase of Mandelstam, and I love to quote Russian poets in the presence of people who know Russian, always makes me feel bad. But it is that nostalgia for world culture. And what he says about the nostalgia for world culture is that what it also makes him long for is the still young Voronezh hills that he came from. You know, and there is this wonderful sense of your own place in relation to the world. And I hear that in the poems that you read tonight, even as they ventured far away, there was your own place in them too, and it was really great to hear you reading. I might ask everybody to, if you have a final comment to make, please drop it into the chat. And I know that Jazz is going to pop up the link again at the end of the chat for those of you who'd like to pick up copies of the book. But thank you so much to Jason, to Rebecca, to Charlotte, and to Susanna for really brilliant readings. An absolute pleasure on a Thursday night. And we might see many of you who've been watching us tonight back at our next event next Thursday night. Good night.